Hey there. Today I'm going to show you how to build some very simple grassy, rocky, crag plateau type things that'll add a little bit of elevation to your tabletop, add a little bit of line of sight blocking terrain, and generally just dress up everything. These are very simple, and these were inspired, if not directly, taken from videos from Winters SEO and Wyloch. If you don't follow those two channels, I absolutely recommend them. Both of them are fantastic. This is sort of a mix between the two. Winters uses a different technique to do a rocky texture on the sides and then makes the grassy plateaus. And Wyloch uses this technique for the texture on the sides that I'm doing and then leaves the plateaus rocky and gravelly on top without the grass. And I liked the grass and I liked the other rocky texture, so I combined the two, and this is what we came up with. Follow along. It should be fantastic. It should be real easy. Thanks. Alright, so the first step is to get some foam, and here I'm using insulation foam. I got this for pretty cheap out of a construction recycling type place where people brought old construction materials. So it was an inch thick, and I've cut it into circular-ish shapes to make my craggy plateaus. What I'm doing is taking a crafting knife and just scoring along the edges, first horizontally and then vertically, and this will allow me to take a butter knife, is what I use, and scrape along the sides, and that creates a nice rocky texture on the edges of the foam. You can see I'm dragging the knife across the scored edges, just back and forth until it tears up the foam well enough that it looks like a nice rock texture, and then I use my fingers to brush off any loose bits that were about to fall off anyway. And you'll be able to see it better once it's painted, but that does create a nice rough, random, and somewhat rocky looking texture on the edges of the foam. So now I've got all of my pieces, the sides textured. I've got them stacked up in an order that makes sense to me, and I just cut all these shapes out randomly. I made some bigger ones and made some smaller ones, and then just stacked them up in an order that looked good. And you can see these are a little bit smaller pieces. These are mostly just for line of sight blocking. These aren't necessarily big enough for your guys to stand on top of, certainly not whole squads, maybe a character or two. And then I'm using a hot glue gun to glue them together, and hot glue works perfectly well for this as it's quick and glues them together nicely. You can use PVA glue, but that'll just take a while to dry. Next, I use PVA glue to attach some rocks as if they had crumbled off the sides. And using PVA glue here is a better choice than hot glue, because hot glue does not recede as it dries. PVA glue kind of shrinks, and you can't see it from underneath rocks once it's dried, whereas hot glue does not recede at all, and so you can see the glue texture through the rocks, which is not, I don't feel like it looks very good. When you go to try and paint it, you can kind of tell that there's glue in amongst the rocks, and I don't like the way that it looks. So I just pick out a few areas where it looks like rocks might have crumbled off of the sides of the cliff faces there, and then just sprinkle some small gravel over the glue. And then you've got to let this sit for quite a while to let the rocks dry, and you definitely want to make sure the glue's dry before you start painting it, because the wetness of the paint will just pull the rocks right out of the glue if it hasn't dried completely. You just kind of shake it off and get the loose rocks off of there, and set it aside and wait for it to dry. Now you can see what I've done is base coated everything black. For this I used acrylic paint, just cheap paint from Walmart, and watered it down pretty decently so that it would run into the cracks very easily. You could spray paint this, but you need to seal it with something first, as the spray paint will dissolve the foam. So if you were to cover it in PVA glue first, you would be able to spray paint it. But then of course you'd need to wait for the glue to dry as well. And then what I do is take some cheap black paint, some cheap white paint that's a little off-white paint, not pure white, and mix it together to create a nice medium gray, and start to dry brush the textures on the sides. You can see the dry brushing really brings out the rock texture very nicely. Dry brushing is an incredibly simple technique that is really easy to make look good. You just get some paint on a brush, scrub it into a paper towel to get most of the paint off, so that the paint on the brush is pretty dry and a little sparse, and then you can just rub it across the textures on whatever it is you're painting. And you can see in this case it deposits the light colored gray on the exposed edges of the texture, and leaves the black in the recesses, which creates a nice shadow, and the light gray highlights the edges of the rock, making them look like rock rather than just black. And then I add a little bit more white to my gray to make it quite a bit lighter, just to do a second layer of dry brushing, which will highlight the edges and the textures even more. And with the white color, the lighter color, you want to be quite a bit more sparing with the dry brushing, just to highlight the most extreme edges of the rocks. And you can see I just hit everything very lightly, and then kind of approach things from the top down, where the light would be hitting the tops of the rock, and certainly wouldn't be illuminating the undersides, so I go from the top down after I get the edges highlighted nicely to a point where I like it. Next, after that dry brushing has dried, and that doesn't take long to dry at all because of how dry the paint is to begin with, I just use some PVA glue to spread over the top areas of the little plateaus to be flocked. Now, if you didn't want this to be grassy, you could have, when you put the gravel on, you could have covered these areas in sand to make them look a little bit more interesting and textured, or you could do some sand here and flocking there. I chose to do flocking all over because I like the nice contrast of the grass with the rock. I think it looks interesting and sort of brightens up the pieces. So I deposit glue in areas where I think it should go, and you can see I'm hitting this little smaller parts that come out to add little bits of color in amongst the larger masses of rocks. I pick out all the areas I want, and I add glue there so I don't forget anything as I'm going, and then I use a brush to spread it around. And then once you got the glue spread out across the entire piece in areas where you want it, I just cover everything in flock. And this flock is homemade, that I just use some cheap paint to dye some sawdust, and then stuck it in the oven to dry it out at a low temperature, and it works pretty well. It was incredibly cheap. The sawdust was free, paint was about 50 cents, and it was very simple. So this is what I've been using to flock things that don't need to look absolutely perfect. And I mean, it looks pretty good as far as I'm concerned. So I just cover all the glue in flock. I make sure to pile it on kind of deep so that the glue has a chance to absorb into everything that it wants to, to create a nice layer of flock once everything's done. And then I just let it sit to dry for a few hours. The glue will take, again, probably about 24 hours to dry completely, but I let it sit probably about 6 hours in this case before shaking all the excess flock off. You could do that immediately, but I just wanted to let the glue take hold a bit and everything that it was going to try and increase the thickness of the layer of flock, so I didn't get you wouldn't be able to see the black foam underneath the grass. And then I just turn it over and tap it off, and you can see it leaves a nice good looking layer of green flock on top, which adds a nice contrast to the rocks. I think it looks pretty nice. And then I let these sit for overnight to let the glue continue to dry completely. And again, this is what your finished product could look like. Again, very simple, very effective. Just really the only part that takes any amount of time is just waiting for the PVA glue to dry in the various steps, and that's really the most significant part. This is what a few pieces look like on the battlefield with a few models set up. The two that were shown in this video were two of the smaller pieces. I also made some larger pieces with a little bit more space on top, a few more levels, blocked a little bit more line of sight, to create a more dynamic battlefield. So again, the two that I showed are just the two smaller pieces that I made to add accents to areas that needed some more attention. If you enjoyed the video, please stop by again. I'll be making more videos. I've got a few ready to be edited already, and they should be released hopefully on some sort of schedule. And we'll see if we can figure out how to make some more simple, effective terrain that looks good on the battlefield. Appreciate you watching the video again. Genuinely appreciate your support. Thanks for stopping by.